All right, here's a 2000 Honda Civic, and we're doing lower control arms in the front. We've already got the lower control arm out, and the reason we're replacing it is because of the bushings having failed. This is my buddy Todd's car, and he took it in to get an alignment, and they said, no way, your bushings are wasted. And the lower ball joint was also very wasted, and that is actually cut because it did not want to let go. Not for nothing. Look at the beating that thing took, and it just didn't let go. It wouldn't pop out. Not for nothing. Luckily, we got new ones in the kit, and so we've got the new one pushed in already. Here's the new lower control arm, and then over here is the new lower ball joint. So we're about ready to go ahead and start putting stuff back together here. So the lower ball joint here goes into the lower control arm here, and we're going to go ahead and bolt him back in first. But just to show, here's where it come from. There's these two bolts, this guy in this opening right here, and yeah, that's my ugly welding. I had to put a big ugly tack on there because that body nut actually busted loose when I took the breaker bar to it to get it to come loose, and I started hitting it with the gun, and it busted loose, and it busted off of its weld, and so I get to put an ugly weld on there. The other horizontal nut, or bolt rather, that one held just fine, and that of course sits behind just about everything in here. You know, wheel has to come off, the caliper has to come off, the housing behind the caliper has to come off, rotor has to come off, and then you're able to get that piece that was on the bench that we put the new ball joint into off, and then the lower control arm can come out. So yeah, good times. Now we get to start putting it back together, and it should be pretty smooth sailing going from here. Everything gets anti-seized when it goes back together, because this was a fight. Everything was a fight. This hadn't been apart in quite some time. Everything was a fight. It didn't want to let go. And actually, for the record, on this guy, there's supposed to be like a mud shield back behind here to keep shit from splashing up on the rotors, and that's long gone. So that explains the fight that I had getting that rotor to come loose after getting the stripped out nut or screw that was holding that rotor in. It was just good time after good time. But yeah, now we're on the way. I'm gonna start putting it all back together. Should be pretty slick. That's where it's fucked up. Oh yeah, baby, that is flopping around nasty style. Okay, now I'm okay with the alignment guy saying what he said about this thing. Holy crap. Okay. Yes, and so depending on what kind of lower ball joint you get, we had to put the grease zert on and then grease it, and then go back with the plug that it came with, because there is no room for the actual head to be able to have it and be a greasable fitting. So we did fill it with grease and put the plug back on it, because there ain't room for that guy by the time you have your CV axle with the head on it and the tone ring for the ABS. Yeah, then there ain't no room. So we grease it first, plug it, and that's how we're gonna roll. Alright, so it's all put back together on the passenger side anyway, and that 19mm bolt that holds the front side of the lower control arm is run in and good and tight, and that 19mm bolt that runs in through the back side of the lower control arm is good and tight. And we've got our new lower ball joint, and he's got his cotter pin, and everything else is put back together. The brakes and the ABS sensor and the sway bar end link, and we might just be able to show how there really isn't room for that grease zerk all we got room for is basically just that plug, and that's all the room there is in there. So with the lower ball joints that we got today, we cannot have that awesome grease fitting in place. We just got to grease it and plug it and run it. So that's what we're doing. And we got some anti-seize because, boy, that was a fight getting that rotor loose. It was nasty down there. So we're not going to let that happen in the future. And on to the other side. Thank you. Wheel lugs, 19 millimeter, 12 millimeter to get the caliper, and then 17 millimeter for the bracket to keep the caliper. If you have ABS, that's a 10 millimeter bolt for the ABS sensor. Now it's a 50-50 shot as to whether or not that sensor is going to come out clean, or whether or not you would be smart to go ahead and take the wire all the way back from under the hood and bring the wire down. We're not going to figure that out on tape. We're going to go ahead and do that in a second. Okay, so we got lucky with the wiggle and pull on the ABS sensor. The 17 millimeter ball joint on the bottom came out with the impact. It didn't say no. So we're moving on. And those two bolts, nuts rather, from this side above and below the brake line are 19 millimeter on both sides. And that's a through bolt that does not affect your camber. So I just grab that on both sides and impact one, back the other side up, and boom, 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 boom. Onward and upward. It was actually pretty hilarious. All right, so the ball joint goes in here and it ties onto the lower control arm here. The ball joint comes up through the bottom of the lower control arm. On the other one, we were wailing on it, and it actually mushroomed that tip of that old lower ball joint, and it just would not let go. This one, I hit it a couple times, and it actually blew out of this pressed in fitting, flew out of here. Everything came apart with just a few hits with the hammer. It was incredible. That was just great. Cool. All right, so the same story like the other side. Grease the ball joint first, put the plug on it because we know we won't have clearance, and bring this guy over to the underneath of the driver's side, where we've already put the two 19 millimeter bolts that run through that lower control arm. And so this guy, his ball joint, is going to sit in here. This has a conical seat. It makes sure that the cone points up, and you'll be in good shape. So we're going to thread the needle then, and the ball joint end goes here. The spindle goes into this bad boy here, and then our two 19 millimeter bolts go back on the top. And hell, with the exception of that sway bar end link, we'll be ready to put brakes on it and call this thing wonderful, or at least test drive ready. Okay, so almost done. 17 millimeter bolt on the sway bar end link is put back together. We still need to do our lower ball joint. He needs to be tightened down and cotter pinned. But our ABS sensor is put back in place. Our 19 millimeter bolts that hold the top half of this guy are all put back together. Our nut here on the end of our CV axle is nice and tight. So we're going to cotter pin underneath here, put brakes back together, and it looks like we'll be going on a test drive here in good old Todd's Honda Civic, and think it's going to be ready and good enough for an alignment, and that'll make for a happy Todd. Good deal. And that's it. New lower control arm is installed. Again, that's a 19 millimeter bolt. That's a 19 millimeter bolt. And then the ball joint at the underside of it. If you can find a way to get just that and only that loose and not take everything else out, well, more power to you. But I did it this way. everything's put together. We're ready to put the wheel on, go for a test drive, and that's it. Beer 30. Thanks for watching.